In this video, I'm going to show you how to adjust the travel of a Fox fork internally using this air shaft assembly. This will be on a 2016 fork, and this will apply to both the 32 and the 34 millimeter stanchion forks. So let's get started. Let me show you what you'll need for this service. You'll need a 26 millimeter socket wrench. Now for years I've used the one that wasn't ground down. Recently I got the one from Fox, which is ground down, which is really flush, which I would recommend because if it's not, it can slip when you're trying to remove the top cap. Even though you put some pressure on it, if it's not ground down, it can slip. You'll also, I would recommend, you don't have to have these. This is the first time I've used these. I just got these from Fox. These are tools to dislodge the bolts sticking out the bottom of the spring side and the damper side. So if you've got a 32 millimeter stanchion fork, you just need the smaller one. If you've got a 34, you're going to need both. And again, it's not like you have to have these, but it does make the job a little bit easier and helps protect, especially on the damper side, that little protrusion sticking out the bottom. You'll need a shock pump. You'll need the Fox 20 weight gold oil. You'll need, of course, the air shaft assembly, and in this case I'm taking a 120 and going down to 100, so I got the one that goes to 100. And you can jump on Fox's website. They list, there's quite a few depending on which travel you're running and the inside diameter of your stanchion tubes, all that. It will come with this retaining clip, but you could probably reuse the one inside. These air volume adjusters, you may need one, and I'll talk about that when it comes time to do that. You'll need some slick honey. This stuff, I've had this forever and it lasts forever. It's really great for suspension forks, and that's what I would recommend getting for this job. You probably want to have some crush washers on hand, 2 of them. So get some crush washers from Fox. There's a chance you could reuse your old ones, but it's easier if you have these on hand, and especially if one is damaged. You'll need either a pick or a little flat blade screwdriver. I typically will use the flat blade screwdriver to get the retaining clip out. You'll need a mallet. You'll need definitely a 2 millimeter Allen wrench for the red rebound knob at the bottom. You may also need a 5 to get the brake caliper off the bike, and a 2.5 if it's a Fox fork for that little cable retention device. You'll need some containers just to drop the oil into. You'll need a little, I would recommend this little cheap syringe that you can get at a drugstore to measure the amount of oil you're putting back in the fork, and it really makes it easy to use one of these instead of trying to pour it back in the bottom. You'll need a 10 millimeter socket, and I would also highly recommend a torque wrench. If you're doing a 34 millimeter stanchion fork, you'll also need a 15 millimeter socket. And then finally, you'll need some rubbing alcohol just to wipe everything down when you're all done, and some paper towels. All right, the first thing that I would recommend doing, and this is a trick that I've learned over the years, is loosen the air cap with the bike on the ground. That way you can press down on the socket wrench. So unscrew your air cap cover. So I'm just going to take that off, lay it aside, and then I'm going to take my socket wrench, and because the bike's on the ground, I can really put some pressure down on that socket wrench, and we're just going to loosen it just a little bit because it's still got air pressure in there, especially if you don't have a socket wrench that's ground down. So I'm going to kind of put my knees around the tire, push down, and we're just going to loosen it. So it just turned a little bit, and then I'm going to let the air out. Okay, so just press down, let the air out of the shock. Of course, it'll decrease. And then I'm going to put this bike in a work stand. I didn't show it. A work stand is recommended for this. If you don't have a work stand, you're going to have to hang the bike up a little bit because we got to drop the lowers off. And you can take the fork out of the bike. This service, I'm not going to do that. This is a pretty quick service, and so I'm not going to actually remove the fork from the bike, but you can do that if you would like to. And if you don't have a work stand, that actually might be easier. All right, I've got my bike in a work stand, so we're going to take off the front wheel. And you may actually have the front wheel off already. And now we're going to remove the brake. And I didn't show this, so it's going to depend on what kind of brake you have. But I've got a 5mm Allen wrench for my brake. And we're just going to remove the brake caliper from the bike. Just another tip I'll throw in here. If you have a brake caliper that has bolts with a lot of washers, like the Avid ones do, you can take a rubber band or something and put it around the bolts to just kind of hold them onto the caliper so you don't have to put those washer stacks back together. This one just has 2 bolts, so I'm not going to do that, but that's a tip for you. And you're probably going to have some kind of cable retention device on your bike. This is a Fox, and this uses a 2.5mm Allen wrench, and I try not to loosen these all the way, just back it out far enough to get that cable out without actually pulling it off the bike. Now I'm going to take my 26mm socket, and you've already loosened the cap a little bit, so you shouldn't have to put a lot of pressure on it. And we're just going to unthread this all the way, and we're going to pull the air cap out of the bike. Okay, so here is the top cap, and you'll see it's got these volume spacers on it, and you probably want to go on Fox's website and see what the volume spacers are that are recommended for the fork. So this is a 120 going down to 100. The 120 uses one of these spacers, and the 100 stock comes with 2. So if I wanted to kind of make it stock, I would add the volume spacer, just slide it all the way over. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep the volume a little bit low and see how that affects the mid-stroke when I reduce this fork down to 100. And your fork usually will come with these. So if you buy a fork from Fox, you'll get a few of these in the box so you can adjust the volume. It's a pretty cool feature that they've come out with on the newer forks. Now, using your 2mm Allen wrench, we're just going to loosen the screw on this red rebound knob at the bottom on the damper side. And you don't need to back it all the way out, just enough so that the knob will slip off the bottom. And by the way, it does have a little indentation, so when we put this back on, we want to make sure we line up the screw back to this little indentation. All right, now we're going to use on the spring side a 10mm socket wrench just to loosen this nut at the bottom. And it's not going to be on there very tight. These things are only about 5 or 6 Newton meters. I'll give you the exact torque specs when it's time to put them back on. So just remove that nut, and you should not have any oil coming out yet because you really got to dislodge the bolt that comes out the bottom. So we'll take that all the way off. Now you will have a crush washer in here. This is a new fork, so I'm going to reuse this crush washer. Normally you would always replace these and have these on hand. But this one, it usually stays in the nut. Sometimes it'll stick onto the bolt coming out the bottom, but this one stayed in the nut as it usually does. So just make sure you don't lose that. And the same thing on the damper side. Now if you're doing this on a 34mm stanchion fork, the damper side is going to take a 15mm socket wrench. This is a 32, so it's got a 10mm socket wrench. So we'll just go ahead and do the same thing. Now on the damper side, you got that little protrusion where the rebound knob goes onto. Just make sure you're careful that you don't bend it. It's not like it's real easy to bend, but always, you know, it's an expensive component, so just work carefully as you do this. Okay, now, so on this one, the crush washer actually stayed on the threads a little bit. Came all the way down to the bottom and then just stopped, so I just want to twist that crush washer off the threads. Alright, now we get to use our cool looking tool here. It's the first time I've used it, so always fun to use a new tool. So this will thread on. And again, you can use an old nut if you have one, just kind of reverse it. So you're going to thread this on, not all the way, probably about halfway, enough to get some threads on there, but not all the way. And then we're just going to tap the bottom with the mallet. Okay, so we're just going to tap the bottom, and that's going to dislodge, and we'll have some oil come out. And I've got a little container underneath that you cannot see to catch the oil. And then I'll unthread it, and we should see some oil start coming out. Now I'm going to actually hold my little container a little bit closer, make sure it goes in there. There we go. Alright, same thing on the damper side. Now again, if you have a 32, you're going to use the smaller of these tools, and if you have a 34, you're going to use the larger. I do own a 34 fork also on another bike, so that's why I have both of them. And put my container down there. Now this is where this tool really comes important, because you cannot tap the bottom with a mallet. So on the spring side, you technically could tap those threads without anything on there. I don't recommend it because I have damaged threads before, and that's not fun. But on the damper side, you've got that protrusion, so you cannot just tap that, you'll bend it. So that's where I used to take the old nut and thread it on backwards. Now I've got this awesome tool, so same thing, just tap on it, dislodge it. Okay, we'll have oil start coming out the bottom again. Hold my container down there and let it flow out. Okay, so now all you got to do is drop the lowers off the bike. And you probably will get some more oil coming out, so just keep your little containers down there and let all the oil drip out. Now, I'm not going to really clean this. Like I said, this is a new fork. But if you were doing this as an oil change, which I'll do as a separate video, you would just clean out the inside before you proceed to put the fork back together and put the oil in. Alright, so on the spring side, you've got this little retaining ring, and it's got a little lip to it at the end, so you can get like a pick or a flat blade screwdriver underneath it. And I'm going to try the flat blade screwdriver. And just want to very carefully just get in there and dislodge the retaining ring from the groove. Once that happens, it'll come out. Alright, so I got it out of that little groove. And you can just pull it out with a pick or your fingers. Let's try the fingers here. I'm doing this with my fingers just so I can make sure I don't damage anything. Alright, that's it. Now we'll pull this air shaft assembly out, and I'm going to use the tool. This is where this tool really comes in handy because it takes some effort. So I'm going to thread this all the way on and just pull it out. Just kind of wiggle it back and forth. Okay, so that's the 120 air spring assembly or air shaft assembly, and we'll put in the 100. Now it's time to prep to put the new air shaft assembly inside. So take a little bit of slick honey on your fingers, put some inside the stanchion. Obviously we're on the spring side, and now we're going to take the new one and we're going to put some slick honey on this. Fox calls this the neg plate, so we're going to put some on here, on the shaft, and on this little piston here. So just kind of put some slick honey all over that. Okay, so got a decent coating of slick honey on this guy, so now it's just time to put him back inside. Just slide it up carefully, get the neg plate started up in there. Okay, so I pushed it all the way up in there. The neg plate's inside, just kind of push on the shaft. And actually, I didn't really notice this until just now, but Fox actually includes a new new nut and crush washer on the bottom of this air shaft assembly. So obviously make sure you take that off. Okay, now it's time to put the retaining ring back in. And your air shaft assembly, if you buy one, will come with one, but I'm going to reuse the one that it came with since this was a new one, a new fork. And so it's just a matter of just kind of spreading the thing out a little bit and working it up inside there, and then make sure it snaps back into that little groove. That's very important. So just work this thing up in there. All right, so I've got the retaining ring back in there, and you just have to you spread it out, and you can work it in there with your fingers. I didn't have to use any tools. Once it's in there, pull on the shaft pretty good, and just make sure it doesn't, come out. That way you know that retaining ring is locked in. So just give it a little tug, make sure it's locked in there. All right, now I'm going to put 3 cc's or 3 milliliters of the gold oil on top of the air shaft through the top where we pulled the top cap off. Now, just going to thread the top cap back in there, and we're going to tighten it with our socket wrench to 24.8 Newton meters. Now what I do is I tighten it very snug, and then once the bike's on the ground, I go ahead and tighten it fully where, again, I can push down on the socket wrench to make sure it doesn't slip. So we'll tighten that snugly. Okay, so I've got that fairly tight. And again, we'll complete that when the bike's on the ground. And we're going to add some air to it. Okay, so hook your shock pump up and go ahead and put in whatever air pressure you run in your fork. And I usually run about 65. I'm light. Now it's time to put the lowers back on the bike, and I have taken the bike out of the work stand because you got to put oil in the top. If you did not take the fork off the bike, this is what you'd have to do. You have to put the bike on the ground. My stand's it'd be too high if I just tried to rotate the bike in the stand. So just make sure the lowers are going on the right way. And by the way, if you took the fork off the bike, you could just do this probably in the stand or just put it on the ground. So you just want to work the stanchions into the seals, and it will slide on. And you don't want to put it on all the way because we're going to put our oil in the top. So you can see where the little protrusions come out the bottom, where your nuts will go onto. Just back it off a little bit so we can dump some oil in the top. Okay, so this is where I take my syringe, and I've soaked some oil up into the syringe. On 32 and 34 millimeter forks, the left side or the spring side gets 25 cc. So this is a 10 cc syringe. So I'll do 2.5 of these. And the damper side gets 15 on both the 32 and the 34. If you've got a longer travel, just go on Fox's website and find out how much it uses. They have air volume charts for all their forks, so you can do that. So we'll just inject it in there, and I'll do that 1.5 more times on the spring side. Count it out so you don't forget how much oil you put in there. Okay, so I've got the oil on both sides. Again, 25 on the spring side, 15 on the damper side. As you push the lowers back on, you may need to guide the damper side to have that. I'm just going to kind of angle that protrusion a little bit. It comes out to make sure the threads come straight through. And it's a little hard to push down sometimes because you got air pressure in it now. So I recommend putting the nut back on the spring side first. Let's do that. I'm going to tighten it down to 5.7 Newton meters. This is not my torque wrench, but I'll get this snug and then I'll do the exact torque specs. 5.7 Newton meters on both sides. So on the damper side, I'm actually going to put in the new crush washer that came with the air shaft, and it helps to push down on the bridge of the fork. The reason I'm putting a new crush washer on, that one was really tight, and it was kind of hard to get the nut going on there. So a new crush washer will just slide right down. And so push down on the bridge of the fork as you put the damper side nut on. That'll make it a lot easier to keep those threads sticking out. Okay, so using my torque wrench, both sides, 5.7. There we go. All right. Okay, while the fork is still upside down, I'm going to go ahead and put my rebound knob. Again, look for that little indentation on the protrusion and line up your rebound knob adjuster with that. Now this one just happens to be on the inside, which is a little bit of a pain. So we'll have to see if I can get that. But just tighten that back up. Okay, so just as a tip, because that little indentation was on the inside and I couldn't get the Allen wrench, I just put it where I could get to the Allen wrench, tightened it down, twisted it counterclockwise, and then got it to where that little indentation is on the outside. Now I can get that seated in there, and what you want to do is maybe not tighten that down all the way, just a little bit, and see if it catches inside there. Once you know the screw is inside that little indentation, then you can tighten it all the way and not too tight. Alright, now I'm just going to take some rubbing alcohol and put it on a paper towel and just really wipe down the exterior of the fork, because inevitably you're going to have some oil on it, and you definitely don't want to get any fork oil on your disc brake. And by the way, let me just mention, because I left the fork on the bike, I wrapped a rag around my disc brake caliper and just put a rubber band around it to protect it, one, from just banging into the bike, and also to keep any oil off of the disc brake caliper. So that's important. You know, it's probably just as easy just to take your fork off the bike when you do this. But I just wanted to show that you could leave it on the bike. I do it both ways. Usually when I change the oil in a fork, I will take it off the bike, because you do want to clean out your headset every 6 months. Probably about the time it's time to change your oil in your fork. It's probably about time just to get some sand out of your headset. So that's why I usually drop the fork. But since this fork was just recently installed on this bike, I figured I'd show it by leaving it on the bike. Alright, so I've put the wheel back on. I put the cable retention device back on, the brake caliper, all that. So pretty much ready to go. The last thing you really want to do is we're going to snug this up all the way. So because the bike's on the ground, just like when we took it off, we can push down on the socket wrench and make sure that doesn't slip. And 24.8 Newton meters is what this top cap needs to be. And then the last thing, just put on your little cap. And you're ready to go. And since you've changed the travel, I would recommend checking your sag again. You may have less or more weight on the front end. So before you go hit the trail, just check your sag. Of course, push down on the fork. Make sure everything feels normal. And you're ready to go. So that's how you internally adjust the travel of a Fox fork using the air shaft assembly. You'll see it's not that complicated. It's just a matter of having about 45 minutes and the right tools to do the job. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below. Thanks for watching.